Today I have the ultimate scrap busting quilt pattern for you. We are just going to sit back, relax, not worry about what fabrics we're using, and sew. I know that may be a little bit hard, but I promise you it's going to be a lot of fun. I think this will be your go-to quilt pattern when you feel that it's time to just raid your stash and not have to worry about what fabric you're using where and just want to relax and sew. All right, so let's just jump in and start working on this quilt pattern. All right, so in step one, we are just going to get started on this quilt. So you will want to raid your scrap stash and pick some fabrics. Start your fabrics if desired, but you are definitely going to want to press your fabric before you get to cutting. This will ensure that everything is the proper size that you need. And here is your cutting chart. You will also find this cut list in the description of this video and on my blog. I will link to the blog post in the description of this video as well. All right, so I'm just going to be honest and upfront with you. Cutting scrap fabric is definitely not my favorite when it comes to quilting. I do not mind using yardage and cutting it down because you can easily cut your strips and then subcut the strips down to the size of squares or rectangles you need. But with scraps, it can be a little more tricky, right? Because you're not always going to be able to cut strips and then subcut those down. So with the fabric that I pulled, some of the fabric is really easy to cut. It is still long enough and in big enough pieces that I can cut strips and then subcut those strips down to the sizes I need for this quilt. But some of the other pieces are kind of wonky and take a little more care to cut. So while it can be a little more time consuming to prep for a scrap quilt, it really is rewarding to see your stash get smaller, at least a little bit. Because have you ever noticed that sometimes when you are cutting your scraps of fabric, that you end up with even more scraps? There's always these little pieces that aren't quite big enough to let go of, but are too small for the scrap quilt that you're working on. But that is why the stash never ends, right? So after all of the cutting, here are the squares of fabric that I have for creating this quilt. And after finishing step one and getting all that prep work done, we are going to move on to step two. And in step two, we're going to be creating these cute little hourglass squares. And these are 2.5 inches, but I promise you, it is not as daunting as it looks. We'll be creating these two at a time. All right, so to sew one 2.5-inch hourglass block, you're going to need to grab two different 3.5-inch squares that you cut. And I'm going to show you two different ways that you can sew these together. You can just use a line on your sewing machine. I like to use diagonal seam tape to line it up, or you can draw a line on the back of your block from corner to corner. So on the diagonal corner to corner on the back of it, you can draw a line. So I do feel like if you take the time to draw the diagonal line on the back of your block, it's a lot more accurate than any other method, but it does take more time. I do sort of feel like if you are planning to trim these blocks down using a trim tool, being accurate with doing the line doesn't matter as much, but it really is up to you. So once you get your line drawn, if you're going to do that method, you'll place them right sides together, and then you're going to sew a 1/4 inch away from that diagonal line you drew on both sides. So I turned the block around and got the other side there. All right, so there you go. I have one sewn, and you can probably see it a little better here. You have the line we drew and then a line of stitches along each side. So that's one method you could use. Now I'm going to show you I'm gonna grab 2 more of my squares, place them right sides together again, get them lined up. And then if you can see the tape I have here on my sewing machine, there are different lines, a black line, a red line, which is lined up with the needle, and then another black line. These are a 1/4 inch apart. So if you line up the diagonal point of your squares right at the side of your presser foot. Now this only works if you are using a 1/4 inch presser foot. Now the side of your foot lines up with the 1/4 inch black line over here. So if you line up the other opposite diagonal point on that line down here, it keeps you nice and straight to get that same effect that we got before without having to draw the line. Now, a lot of this relies on that you are holding everything steady and looking ahead, making sure everything stays lined up. And it also helps if you got your tape lined up right? Because if you have it kind of at a diagonal and not nice and even, that's going to affect this sew as well. Now, like I said, since I'm going to be trimming all these down, they're all going to be even in the end anyway, but it's kind of up to you and what method you're more comfortable with, right? So after either method that you use, you'll want to press and cut these blocks in half. So I'm just going to press them. It just kind of makes sure everything's nice and flat and even after sewing. And then we are going to cut it in half. So I'm going to cut right along the diagonal here. All right, so I recommend pressing these open. That I find makes all of this a lot easier since you're going to have a ton of seams coming together, because remember this is an hourglass block. So right now we kind of have it where it is a half square triangle, but we're going to need to sew again. Open, and I am just kind of grabbing fabric and sewing them together. I'm not really paying too close of attention to which fabrics are placed where. I'm just kind of keeping this easy and fun and scrappy. All right, so if your seams like aren't laying super flat, now the flatter you get these, the easier it's going to be in the long run. So I have an easy press pin here. This stuff is absolute magic. It will get your seams laying flatter than you have ever seen them before. So just put that on there. And then I let it soak in for a second, and kind of more than a second, like 10 seconds or so, and then add some heat again. And these seams will be, I mean, it's almost like there's not even fabric back there. It's so flat. So now we're going to sew these again. And what you're wanting to do is you're wanting to alternate where they're matching up. So see how we have a purple fabric and the blue fabric? We want those to be right sides together with each other. So you don't want them on the same side. And then we're just going to do the same sewing, just in the opposite direction. So if you are drawing lines, you'll want to do that again. If you're just using the diagonal seam tape, you can use that. Now you really want to make sure, and you may want to put a pin in if you want to have very matching points, but you want that seam to be right on top of each other to make sure that you get perfect points, if you desire perfect points. Not everybody needs that in a quilt, but if you do, make sure those seams are perfectly lined up. All right, so we sewed one side. We're going to flip our block around and sew along the other side. All right, so after we got all that sewing done, we're going to kind of repeat those same steps. We're going to press the block just to make sure that's all nice and even. And then we will cut this in half. All right, and then if you want to have a little peek, there's our little hourglass block so far. And press it open like I did before. Finger press it to get it moving. Because I'm pressing it open, it's a little more challenging because you have to kind of open that seam up a little bit first. I'm going to press it a little, throw the clapper on it, and then I'll use the easy press pin to make sure it stays nice and flat for me. And then after this step, we're still not done because if you remember, I said we're going to trim these down. They're likely not exactly 2.5 inches yet. So there'll be a little trimming. I tried to get it to where we're not having to use like wasting a lot of fabric. I know this is scraps, but we still, we don't want to waste. We don't want to waste. I'm kind of putting way more of that easy press on it than I need to because I'm not really paying a whole lot of attention to what I'm paying attention. I don't mean it like that. I'm just talking and doing stuff and then I'm like, I just emptied half of my pin on this block. It is going to be super flat. All right, so next we're going to trim these up. All right, so you have a few ways you can do this. You can, if you have my little handy dandy trim tools here, you can use these. They are quite lovely. You have all these diagonal lines across here to line up on your seams, and then you'll just cut and turn to trim up your block. These are 2.5 inches. It's sold in a bundle of the 2.5 inch, 3.5 inch, and a 4.5 inch. So it makes it quite convenient to just place it down, trim, turn, trim, turn, trim. I mean, you can get these trimmed up so much faster than using some of the other trimmers out there to get that same size, since you can just keep turning it and not have to realign everything each time. So again, you can trim these down to 2.5 inches with whatever trim tool you like to use. There's a lot of great ones out there on the market. And you can just use any way that you would typically trim down a half square triangle or an hourglass block. So there are two of mine, and I can add them with the other two that I already have. And I have 4 done. And so 4 done, and what is it? I think I have 36 total that I need. So what is that? 32 little hourglass blocks that I still need to do. Obviously, next up is the half square triangles. They're going to be 2.5 inch half square triangles. Those are going to be a lot easier to do because you don't have to sew twice. And then we'll get into those larger blocks. Now there are more of the larger blocks, so it is going to take more time. But remember, we're using up scraps here, or at least that's what I'm doing. I think a lot of you might like using this method for using up scraps. So you could just make one of the blocks at a time. So you could just make the amount of these that you need to complete one of the blocks and move on to another project. When you get more scraps build up, make another block and just kind of make it a fun experience like that instead of getting this whole quilt done all at once. There's a lot of different options there for you. But I am really excited about this quilt. I think it's going to look so fun, and I'm excited to use up a lot of my scraps of fabric. Again, this is all of the fabrics that I have right now. Some of them, I will say, in my 5-inch pile here are from charm packs that I had no plan to use that came in boxes that I grabbed and added to here. So not necessarily scrap fabric per se, but I am happy to finally get some use for it. All right, so I'm going to get all of these 2.5 inch hourglass blocks all ready and trimmed up. And then I will show you the 2.5 inch half square triangles, as well as the other blocks. It's going to be a lot of the same assembly. So I'll move through it a little faster that time, but just so you have it there for reference. All right, so now that all of the 2.5-inch hourglass blocks are finished, we're going to move on to the 2.5-inch half square triangle blocks, and we're going to make these much the same way as the hourglass blocks. We're going to place our 3-inch squares right sides together and then sew along the diagonal twice. So we're going to sew a quarter of an inch away from one side and then a quarter of an inch away from the other. I'm just going to use my diagonal seam tape. If you prefer drawing that line and sewing along either side of it, you can do that as well. So these are going to come together much like the hourglass blocks. We just don't have to sew them together twice. So much quicker. After I get these sewn, we're just going to cut down the middle, press them open, and trim them. It'll come together really quick. However, this time we are sewing a lot more of them. This time we need 108 of these half square triangle blocks. All right, so now that you kind of know how to piece the blocks together, the hourglass block and the half square triangle block, you really know how to piece the next two blocks in this quilt as well. They're just different sizes. I will go over that quickly as well, but I do want to give you a few tips on making this process a little faster. I've been showing doing one block at a time, but you can speed that up a little bit by chain piecing. So I'll show you how I like to do that. So it's much like before. You're going to put two of your pieces right sides together and either sew a quarter inch alongside a drawn line or use your diagonal seam tape or some other tape you may have on your sewing machine or line. And then you're just going to sew along one side. Now, a lot of times, if you're doing one at a time, you would cut your threads here, turn it, and sew along the other side, but we're going to chain piece. So we're just going to grab our next two squares, have them right sides together, and then sew our line of stitches. And you could keep doing this until you sew all of your squares together that you want to get done that day. Or if you would prefer just doing a few this way, instead of having a long line of blocks, you can. But you can sew as many as your heart desires at this point. All right, so I have a few of them here pieced together, and you can see they're all connected together with this line of thread. Now, instead of cutting them apart right now, I'm just going to keep them together and then sew along the other side. So I'll just line up one side and sew my line of stitches along the other side. And this one really makes it a lot faster because one, they're all already lined up and ready to go. And so here they are all sewn together. Now I would just cut the threads apart and cut the half square triangles in half and press them and trim them, and they're all ready to go. This is a quicker way to sew them all. Don't yet have a quicker way to really press them and trim them yet, but maybe one day I'll figure out a way to share that with you all. All right, so after finishing the 108 2.5-inch half square triangles, we're going to move on to creating 4.5-inch hourglass blocks. We're going to be making 108 of these 4.5-inch hourglass blocks. So to make these, you're going to need to take two 5.5-inch squares, place them right sides together, and sew a seam along each side of the diagonal line across this block. So you're going to be putting them together just like you did before. Then you'll be cutting it in half, pressing them open, and then sewing them together again to make the hourglass block. Then you'll just trim them down to size. All right, so after finishing up the 108 4.5-inch hourglass blocks, we're going to move on to making 180, yes, 180 4.5-inch half square triangles. So to do that, you will need 180 5-inch squares. So you'll want to grab two 5-inch squares, place them right sides together, and then again, you're just going to sew a 1/4-inch seam along each side of a diagonal line down the center of this block. Now you can draw that line or you can use your diagonal seam tape. So you'll sew that line along each side, trim it in half, press it open, and then of course trim it down to size to get that perfect 4.5-inch half square triangle. Right? After you get those all sewn up and trimmed, you'll be able to start piecing these blocks together. So I'm just going to go through all these, randomly pick some different colors to go together, sew them all up, get them trimmed down, and then we'll meet back here to lay out the block. All right, so after getting all of those half square triangles cut and trimmed and having all of your other cuts finished, it's time to start laying out the block. So you're going to start with your 2.5-inch hourglass blocks, then move to the half square triangles, and then the 4.5-inch hourglass blocks, and then the half square triangles. So you're just going to work that block out, starting with 4 of your smallest hourglass blocks, arranging them in a way that looks nice to you, however you would like to lay them out. And then if you see some that you're thinking don't look great in the middle, just grab a different block and throw it in there. Then you'll move on and go around that. And I like to alternate so that you make a kind of pattern going around here. I like for them to kind of form triangles rather than that line you saw. So I like them to make the triangle there. I don't like for it to make like a, I don't know, a line. I prefer the triangle. And again, I just grab some that I feel like look great together, and I may have to play around with it for a little bit before I get it perfect for me. But just kind of keep laying that block out and getting it the way you like. See, I don't want those two together like that. So I'll have to find something different for there. So something happened. Oh, because that one's not turned right. That'll happen. So after you get that layer finished, then you'll move on to the hourglass blocks and put them around in the same manner. All right, so you'll work all the way around the block, and then after you get the hourglass circling, you'll add on your half square triangles again. And again, I'm going to do the same thing where they look like a triangle and not where we're forming kind of that line going through there. So you get them all laid out the way you would like, and the first thing you'll have to do is bring these smaller squares together into 4 patches, and you'll make sure you have them laid out the way you like and get them together. So I'll put these on a design board in 4 patches and work them one at a time. Once you get the 4 patches finished, you can sew the rows together. And again, you'll want to line them up, make sure they're lined up the way you like. I'll take pictures of my block when it's laid out so I can refer to it as I sew. That's a tip for you there. Get those 4 patches sewn, then sew your rows together, and then you can bring all those strips of sewn rows together into your block.
And here is the finished block. I think it is so much fun to make. Yes, it is a lot of work getting all the little half square triangles and hourglass blocks trimming and trimming and trimming, but it turns out so pretty. So I definitely think it's worth the time putting it together. And you can just work on one block at a time. You don't have to get all the blocks made at once. You can just work on it as you have scraps available after projects. And it'll be a great way to remember all those past quilts you've made, especially if you've gifted them and they are living with someone else now. So after you get all your blocks made, I'm sharing it with 9 blocks being made. You would just bring the blocks together and sew them all into a quilt. And these blocks are big, so it makes a nice big quilt even with just 9 blocks. All right, I got all my blocks sewn together and here is my finished scrappy quilt. I really love how it turned out. It was so much fun to make, and it's fun that you can kind of work on it and get blocks finished as you go. Let me know if you plan to make one of these quilts in the comments below. And until next time, bye!